everybody. This is our second debate, but our first student-led debate. Some of these guests have agreed to do this for a few months, and I thank them for that. And then I also thank the people that are very much last minute. So both of you, thank you very much. I just wanted to start off by getting an indication of where we all stand on the motion. So I was just hoping you defend Boris Johnson and his handling of the pandemic, you are against him, or you're unsure. So let's start with you defend him. Do you defend Boris Johnson's handling of the pandemic? Okay. Anyone unsure? Anyone attacking how he's handled the pandemic? Okay, good to go. So based on that, would you like to start?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see this many people in person for a change. Lord Acton once said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And quite frankly, I can think of no better example of those wise words than the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And believe me, I really did try to find a better example. But no, at the start of this pandemic, Boris spoke of an easy battle against a flu-like disease. He spoke of a strong and united British future. Alas, when he promised to bring us to the peak of a mountain, I confess I didn't realize he meant just below the podium positions for most COVID cases of any country on the planet. I first turned to the Prime Minister's cronyism. The British Medical Journal notes that Boris and his government wasted millions of taxpayer pounds on poor quality and unusable PPE, leaving 30% of care workers unprotected. The PM appointed Baroness Harding, a woman with no qualifications whatsoever, to head up a defunct track and trace system that wasted billions of pounds without even opening up applications for people who might actually be qualified. So unless the Oxford English Dictionary has recently changed the definition of competence to a man who hires his unqualified mates to do a job, leaving thousands of people to die, it is hardly a word applicable to Boris Johnson. Next, I remind you of a PM who used the cover of a pandemic to create legislation violating human rights. The Coronavirus Act's 6-month sunset clause subverts the principle of extreme powers being limited. Instead, the PM has given himself the power to suspend fundamental human rights without parliamentary scrutiny. Considering the original isolation period of 14 days was only 1 day short of the UN's definition of torture by solitary confinement, this ought to be rather concerning to any of us in this room. Lord Sumption, a former Supreme Court judge, argued of COVID legislation that there is no moral obligation to follow the law simply because it is the law, due to its lack of legitimacy. Boris has used this legislation not for the best of the country, but as a cynical power grab against parliamentary sovereignty and to roll back the basic rights he has so vehemently opposed in his criticism of the Human Rights Act. And finally, I remind you of a PM whose bumbling and chaotic approach to this pandemic has simultaneously managed to ruin our economy whilst allowing tens of thousands of people to die. During the first year of this pandemic, parliamentary inquiry found that COVID legislation had been changed at least 60 different times. To say that this ensures law is consistent and easy to follow is laughable. Whilst Boris Johnson assured the media that the law was simple to understand, he himself managed to get the rules confused on live television. If Boris truly thinks a person could reasonably understand the current law, he must not consider himself in that definition of a reasonable and sensible person. Whilst many world leaders, including Merkel and Arden, have proved competent in tackling this pandemic, the PM has barely proved himself fit to run a bath, let alone a country. So, ladies and gentlemen, the fact Boris Johnson may have tried to tackle the pandemic is irrelevant. He is not a 4-year-old. He is the Prime Minister, and thus we have a right to demand he does not any old job, but a good job. And this is something we have not seen him do. Yes, perhaps Boris Johnson did do the best for the situation, but if he did, that was the best for himself and his cronies, not for the country. Thank you.
That was John T. from Christ College. Downing.
Sorry.
And next we're going to Hugo.
Thank you. As an unashamed and unapologetic conservative, I feel as though coming to a King's Politics debate is a bit like walking into the lion's den. So thank you for coming and for listening. I'd like to use my opening statement to less sort of engage head on with some of the things that we've just heard, and I will not shy away from doing that later on, but rather to set some of the terms of the debate, in particular to ask the question, how ought we to go about evaluating Boris Johnson's response, or the government's response to the coronavirus pandemic? And the approach that is taken most commonly and most publicly and has just been taken is one that I would characterize as being broadly consequentialist. So you judge Boris Johnson and the government's handling of the pandemic on the basis of the effects of their policy. So you worry about things like excess deaths, you worry about damage to the economy, you worry, yes, you're nodding along enthusiastically, good, yes, and this is what people do. Now, I think this is actually a bad way to judge governments in general, but in the particular context of a pandemic, I think it's really quite silly, and I will come on to why. But just to get a slightly clearer idea of what I'm doing, I think it's falls on me to describe what the alternative is, because there does seem to be something very obvious about judging government by the effects of its policies, and the alternative is to judge them by the standards that they were considering when they put policy into place. In other words, you judge them by their reasons, you judge them by their intentions, and you judge them by their motives. And this raises quite an immediate problem, is that politicians are uniquely dishonest about what their motives and intentions and reasons are. And that has been true of politics in general, but it's in particularly true of the government's response to the pandemic, partly because of they've been heeding the advice of public psychologists and things like that. But so we're presented with the problem. I want you to judge the government on what its reasons were for implementing different policies rather than the effects of those policies. And yet we don't know what the reasons are. And so we've got to, I think, to come up with a sort of best interpretation based on what we know about the people in government, about what they did, and about how the decision process is made. And the interpretation that I want to present over the course of this evening, when we get on to finally the some substantive issues, is that the government responded to the coronavirus pandemic not principally as a crisis of public health, nor a crisis of the economy, but as a moral crisis. COVID totally reset what our understanding of what we owe to each other and what we owe to society and what society owes to us. And it raised a couple of nightmare moral scenarios that I think have been the center of the government's response to the pandemic. And that response has been guided, I think, by very admirable humanistic principles. So principles of the value of human life, the value of human freedom, human flourishing. Anyway, why is the consequentialist approach so bad? And I realize that it's a slightly strange dialectic move to sit up here and start talking about ethics and philosophy when I've got a sort of left-wing info bomb off at me about to offload all sorts of stats and figures and all the bread and butter of good materialists like the Labour Club. And so if you would indulge me for a minute, cast your mind back to March 2020, when there was this strange, somewhat mysterious disease that we started to hear of in the press. We had no idea how quickly it would spread, how lethal it would be. There were contradictory reports coming out of Wuhan. Then suddenly it was in Italy and it was Iran, and there was extremely incongruous situations in Italy and in Iran. No good way of gathering the data. It was really, there was a sort of information blackout on COVID. We didn't know how lethal it was, we didn't know how infectious it was. We didn't know if there were going to be vaccines. We didn't know if there were going to be efficacious therapies. And the government was suddenly tasked with stopping the spread of this unknown disease. And it was given a set of options, the efficacy of which it also didn't know, because no government has ever tried to put the nation into lockdown before. So they had no idea whether face masks would stop it. They had no idea whether national lockdown would stop it. They had no idea how long we should wash our hands for, whether we should sing happy birthday or say the Lord's Prayer. In fact, there were lots of countries in February, in March and April, which took radically different approaches. And this was not because there were sort of radically different ideologies at play, because there was radically different information and radically different opinions coming from the people who knew best. And that was, of course, scientists and experts, Professor Whitties of the world, people on stage. And it's been clear throughout the pandemic that on all major issues, the government has been deferring to them to call the shots, basically. Whether it's when to go into lockdown, how soon to open up, what to encourage, what to discourage. It's always been guided by the advice they've gotten from their best scientific advice. But that's not to say that they know everything. There's a huge amount of disagreement within SAGE itself. Throughout the pandemic, the government was hearing one world expert say one thing, another world expert say, no, that's total nonsense. Now, I think it would have been foolish and dishonest to base government policy on beliefs that, for all they knew, could have been false, and probably were false, and it turns out were in fact false. They had no idea what the effects of their different policies were going to be. They had no idea of the different trajectories the pandemic was going to take. So I think it's unreasonable then to judge them on decisions they make on the effects of them, when they had no idea and no way of knowing what the effects of those policies were going to be. Even if they did know, I think this broadly consequentialist approach opens up some absurd comparisons, especially in the context of a pandemic. Normally, the debate is set in terms of, number of days in lockdown and economic consequences versus number of deaths or number of infections. Because that's broadly the trade we have to make. If we want to stay inside all day and not go to work, that saves lives, but on the other hand, it has some downstream consequences. This is overly simplistic. Just give 3 examples that I encourage you all to go and look up: statistics on the number of missing children over the past 18 months, the number of children who've been referred to mental health services for self-harm, and the number of children who've just dropped out of education completely. All, I think, fairly obviously as an effect of suddenly being locked up in their homes for months on end. And I think the sort of psychological literature is also pretty consistent on that, that's the reason. Now, if you want to judge the government on consequentialist terms, if you want to see, okay, well, was it right to lock us all up for 3 months? Should we have done it for 6 months? Should we have done it for 2 weeks? What ought we have done? The kind of calculations you have to make is how many children are we going to allow to become self-harmers to save one life? How many children are we going to let fall out of education so that infection rates fall by, I don't know, 1 person in a million? And those questions, they're silly, they're absurd. There's no way of deciding them, and I think it shows a deep misunderstanding of what is important, if that's what you go about making your decisions on. It reduces people to data points in sort of vast social calculus that's traded around and swapped like livestock. So because of these absurd comparisons, and because of the unreasonable epistemic expectations of the consequentialist approach, I think that it's silly to go about judging the government on the effects of its policies. And so what I hope to do from now on is provide you a sort of alternate story, alternate interpretation of lots of different things that the government is going to be criticized for, and show you that there is a way of understanding it, there's a way of seeing it as a very principled, humanistic response to a moral crisis, as much as anything else. Thank you.
We're now going to Luke over here.
Now, it's very tempting for someone in my position to blame a government for causing 140,000 deaths. However, that isn't the reality, and this virus was always going to be deadly. However, just because this virus was deadly doesn't mean that this government couldn't have done more to avoid the disaster that's been created. I understand that any leader would have to make difficult choices between public health and personal freedoms. And yet, Boris Johnson has chosen the worst of both worlds. In this past year and a half, we've not only had our freedoms taken away, but at the cost of lives. Now, my opposition spoke of principle and motivation in response to the pandemic. This is a man who once said that his real boss was the Daily Telegraph. How can we trust a purely humanistic motivation when this man admits that he is controlled by pundits? At the same time, he is an elected politician who has just won the biggest Conservative majority since the 1980s. This man is highly motivated by whatever means to maintain that majority. As much as that may coincide with humanism, it does not mean that his intentions were humanistic. The response of our institutions and of this country at large may well have been humanistic, but it was in spite of Boris Johnson and not because of it. Here we have a man who has, in the words of Dominic Cummings, nearly went to see the Queen after announcing a crisis. This is a man who doesn't reflect on the deep humanistic level that my opposition claims that he does. To conclude my point, we can accept that this country made the best out of a bad situation, and we can accept that the people of this country attempted to save as many lives as possible. But can we accept that this man was principled and the cause of this? I think given his record, we cannot.
Thank you very much. We're now turning to Sam.
I'm not really going to sit here today and defend every single aspect of government policy. I don't think that's really going to be useful to do. And I concede that the government and Boris have made mistakes along the way. I think it's impossible not to do so. But I think we have to, and kind of following on from Hugo here a bit, we have to judge the government in certain ways. And I'm not going to go really on the same line as Hugo outside of for a lot of speech. I kind of wanted to build on what he was saying about science and how different places had different information, and how the government didn't exactly know the consequences of their policies at the point in time in which they made policies. Let's look at why that is. The reason that was is because we haven't had a public health crisis like COVID in 100 years. We have never had government as complex, or in the manner in which government currently is, responding to such a crisis. And likewise, we didn't have the absolute information at the time. Now, I don't know what was said in the SAGE meetings, and I don't know what was said privately between Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance and the Prime Minister. But in the same way, what I do know is there's been remarkable stability in the civil service, in SAGE, in the chief medical officer and their deputies throughout the pandemic, which suggests to me at least that there has been at least some consistency between government policy and the information they've been saying. What that means is the chances are the government have been following the science, following the information that scientists were passing on for a great deal of the pandemic. Now, yes, there were errors made along the way, at least, for example, Jonty mentioned PPE, but in the same way, if the government are following the science and aiming for their capacity, and again, following on from Hugo, the government's aim also was to ensure the NHS was not overwhelmed, and therefore adopted scientific policies that was to prevent that from happening. And that largely has happened. At no point in time, outside of a few unique cases throughout the pandemic, have hospitals actively had to reject patients. When that was likely to happen, the government set up Nightingale wards at various large conference centres so as to prevent any terrible dystopian choices between having to choose between younger and older patients, or having to choose between two patients and what ventilator they might want. So I want people to consider actually what information was, what information the government actually had at the time, what they were being fed by the scientists, before judging and automatically stating that the government have done just this terrible job and looking only at the death rate. Because, as I said, they were likely getting different information than other countries. And I think kind of on that, and another way to judge what the government have done in the pandemic is by comparing us to other countries. Because I think when opposition will criticize what Boris have done, they forget that no country really in the world has actually got this perfect. No country has really done even well in this. Maybe New Zealand are a good example. And sure, there are Southeast Asian countries with fundamentally different political systems and thus fundamentally different concerns. But when a country such as Belgium, with a similar population density to us, also have a similar case rate to us, also have a similar death rate to us, and adopted similar policies, one can see that actually maybe the government didn't do as bad as they might have suggested. These are just some things to consider. I'll come on to it more in the next couple of speeches, because I believe I'm running out of time. But please consider these ways in judging the government before automatically stating the government have done this just terrible job. It was a terrible job to have. It was a toxic job to have, and the government were likely never going to succeed in satisfying everyone and getting every policy, or even 70% of the policy decisions right. But I firmly believe the government have done what they can to do as well as possible in the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. We're now going to Jonathan.
Look, I think it's pretty clear, and they accept it, that there was a significant degree of failure. And I think that's why they're trying to change this debate to one about motives and about whether those failures were necessary, as opposed to one about the extent of failure. But I'd just like to first emphasize how big of a failure this is. I mean, the Health and Social Care Parliamentary Committee and the Science and Technology Parliamentary Committee, both chaired by Conservatives, have released a report calling this the most important public health failure, policy failure, in British history. And I think that that's pretty true, because given the resources we have now, given the decisions, the scientific advice they have messed this up substantially. How have they messed this up? Because I think Sam and Hugo hide to a great degree behind SAGE and saying that these decisions come from SAGE. And I think for the most part they do. The important places where Boris Johnson specifically failed are the places where he refused to act on SAGE advice, and given the timescales we're talking about, delayed the response in October and over Christmas, and in certain periods after the new year, particularly with children going back to school. All of those delays added up to masses of more cases and deaths at moments where SAGE was both telling the Prime Minister and then briefing to the media that they were trying to get the Prime Minister to change and do policies that he was unwilling to do because he was more beholden to the Conservative Party and Conservative Party MPs and Libertarian MPs in particular than to civil servants and scientists. I think that those are the most substantial failures. And I want to get away from what Hugo said, which is to focus on March and to focus on the start of the pandemic. Because I agree, very few people had a good idea of what was going on in March 2020. We had a much, much, much better idea of what was going on over that summer and into October and over Christmas, when Boris Johnson, knowing full well that it was a very bad idea and that it was a promise he could not keep, promised to let people open up over Christmas, took that away, and in so doing prevented all the hard work of the second lockdown from going to good because they rebounded and reopened too early. I think all of those decisions add up into one of monumental failure where political choices intervened on public health choices in a very, very toxic way. Hugo wants to talk a lot about consequentialism. And I think broadly evaluating a government on its outcomes is a pretty good way to evaluate governments. But I'll talk about a bit about the things he wants to talk about in a moment. But on the pure facts, we've had over 2,000 deaths per million. That is higher than Belgium. It is also higher than France. It's also higher than Sweden with their herd immunity strategy. It's also higher than Germany and the vast majority of EU countries. It wedges us somewhere directly in between Tunisia and Armenia. Armenia is just below us, Tunisia is just above us. I think that's terrible for a country with one of the largest health services in the world, one of the best funded. And I think that it speaks to not only the failures of Boris Johnson, but the failures of successive Conservative governments to properly stockpile PPE, as a report in 2016 told them to, and failures of governments that Boris Johnson and all his colleagues were in. I think it further speaks to the extent to which this failure is, unlike what Sam says, a unique one that is different from other countries in the world who, whilst also making their own mistakes, have certainly done a lot better than Britain. Sam wants to talk a lot about how they made tough choices and some of them pulled off. And I agree that it was a good idea to open wards like Nightingale, but we have to remember that the reason hospitals were not overwhelmed isn't because we did something better than other countries. It's because we were turning away cancer patients and patients who needed other treatment in a way that countries like America or France couldn't do because they had private hospitals. So I think if you factor in those excess deaths, I think you realize that hospitals were overwhelmed. It's just the people who are being turned away were not COVID patients, they were other essential patients. That's an important thing to consider on that. I think when Hugo wants to talk about motives and how well motives get fulfilled, I think what Hugo misses is two things. First, I think it's very reasonable to ask in a debate like this, were his motives the right ones? And I think for much of the pandemic, his motives of herd immunity were not the right ones. Even if he fulfilled his aims to some degree, I don't think those were the right ones. Second, when Hugo talks about things like freedom, value of life, and human flourishing, those were the three principles he said Boris Johnson followed. Within COVID policy, those three directly contradict. I'm not sure what principle Hugo thinks Boris Johnson is following if all the principles Hugo claims that he's operating under directly contradict and at different times he's prioritized different ones with the effect of having a chaotic response. And that response has led to all the things Hugo says about children's mental health and about education, because Hugo makes this sound like a zero-sum game between children's suicides and education on the one hand and between a proper response on the other. It isn't a zero-sum game. The government should have and could have provided laptops to children in education. The government should have and could have provided much better mental health services within schools and outside of schools. It didn't because it was wasting money on corruption and other things that, frankly, they did not need to do. I think the failure is a public health one, but it's also an economic one. It's also an educational one, in which choices were made to turn this into the zero-sum game that Hugo was talking about, rather than doing wholesale help and aid for people across society. And I think the results are there in the fact that our economy is lagging behind America and loads of other G7 countries in rebounding. And I also think that we're probably going to leave this crisis later than other countries, because even though we started strong in our vaccine rollout program, we're currently on 74% first rate doses, and France is above us, and Portugal is above us, and many European countries are above us, despite the fact that the largest vaccine producer in the world is headquartered in Britain, which is the reason for our strong start in the first place. And this is a kind of scattergun approach of failure, because I think the failures have been in different places at different times across the 2 years. And I'm going to wrap up now, but what I think that means is there have been moments in the pandemic when things have been handled well, normally moments when SAGE takes control. And there have been moments where Boris Johnson has made the active political choice to overrule them with disastrous effects. And I think that it's those second moments we need to focus on. And I think it's very, very, very difficult to defend those kind of choices, particularly over Christmas and over winter last year, and the massive waste that's gone into our response, combined with the neglect of children, mental health services, and a proper investment in failing small businesses and arts and the arts sector. And I think for those reasons, I think it's very difficult to understand Boris Johnson's response as a principled one or as an effective one. And I think that it should be quite difficult for you to side with Hugo and Sam.
Because we are running over a little bit, instead of having 2 rounds of rebuttal, we're just going to stick to the one, keep it to 2 minutes, and then that way we'll have enough time for student questions. So we'll start off with John to begin.
Thank you. I have a couple of points that I'd like to rebut, mainly from Hugo, but I'll start with Sam. Sam said that any government makes mistakes, and the government made mistakes. Well, it's certainly true that any government makes mistakes. It's also certainly true that most governments didn't make quite as many as Boris Johnson's. If they had, there would be a lot of other countries that had as many cases as the UK, but instead it's in 4th place, despite being quite a long way off having the 4th biggest population. It also seems rather an understatement to call cronyism a mistake. I would say it goes a lot further than that, because you can't accidentally appoint a friend with no qualification to run your track and trace program. Turning to Hugo, I'm glad he brought up the government as a whole, because now we can look at how the government tackled social issues during the pandemic, as well as the pandemic itself. Perhaps he would like to explain the fascinating and legendary algorithm that the government came up with instead of exams. Perhaps he'd like to talk about why his health secretary failed to follow social distancing guidelines so spectacularly. In fact, perhaps he'd like to tackle why the Prime Minister, when meeting with NATO, was less than half a metre apart, for that matter. He's not wrong to say that the government achieved everything it set out to. It's just such a shame that everything it set out to didn't include the well-being of our people. Defenders of the PM say that freedom was at the centre of his approach, but if we go back to freedom, we were only 1 day off having our lockdowns and our isolation periods being defined as torture by the United Nations. And as for the question of lockdowns and how to deal with pandemics, whilst the UK may not have faced a large-scale pandemic in a while, it is not true to say the world has not heard of these issues. Perhaps Boris Johnson has not heard of Asia, because I seem to remember Asia doing rather well, using masks and local lockdowns to tackle the SARS pandemic only a decade ago. To say the government has followed the science too is rather farcical, considering that every single system that the government has put in place seems to have been put in place at least a month behind the advice of all the scientists. Thank you.
Speaking of Hugo, we are now going with Hugo.
Sorry, yes. Well, there's an awful lot to discuss. I probably won't get through all of it, so I'll just pick up a couple of points that have been made. Firstly, by Johnny on. Of course, we know a lot more about COVID, about the coronavirus now than we did in March 2020, but we still don't know an awful lot. Just look at the press coverage of the past couple of days. We had these same, sage scientists briefing the press, 2 or 3 days ago that we needed to go into Plan B because cases were skyrocketing. We were going to look at loads of hospitals overrunning in a matter of weeks. And today the press is saying, well, there's been this sudden drop in cases. And we've got the usual too early to tell from, but then some of these same scientists saying that we could be looking at the infection rate halving every 3 weeks or something. I can't remember the exact. So I think it's wrong to say that we now really have a grip on all the different things that come with coronavirus. Another example is vaccine efficacy rates. We thought we'd solved it in, about March of 2021. We thought Pfizer was 92 with 2 doses and AstraZeneca was sort of 84. I can't remember, but of course those are completely changed, and they go on to change because we simply don't know how effective they are. Boosting and that sort of thing. On to the point about cronyism. On the issue of PPE, the focus is understandably always on who the government gave PPE contracts to. It's never on who they didn't give contracts to. If you try and find people who the government didn't give contracts to, it's actually very hard to find anyone. Just about everyone who was offering to procure PPE in about April, May of 2020, they were given contracts by the government. This, to me, is a sign of a government that will do anything to make sure that frontline staff have the equipment that they need. I don't think it's strange for a member of the Labour Party to criticise the government for overspending in a health emergency. And then on track and trace, and Baroness Harding, similar thing. I mean, firstly, I'm not sure you can blame the failure of track and trace on her appointment. If you look at how successful track and trace style apps have been across, it's different in Asia, but across Europe and America, they've all been pretty awful. And no government has found a really great way of doing that. And then you criticize the cronyism that appointed Baroness Harding, but it was the exact same cronyism that appointed Kate Bingham to be head of the vaccine procurement, which has been at least the procurement. I agree, there's now some problems with the sort of rollout of vaccines, but the procurement of vaccines has been one of the unconditioned successes of the government's response to the coronavirus pandemic. And if I was going to try and justify the appointment methods, it would be along the following lines. They needed someone yesterday. They didn't have time to spend on interview process, on selection panels, doing all the due diligence, because the need was there right in front of them. And so they did the best they could. They called on people who they knew, people who they had faith in. I think it'd been worse if they'd called on people who they didn't have faith in, or people who they had no idea who they were. And in some instances it worked out really well, and in some instances it worked out so well, but not totally catastrophically. And then finally, I'll let Sam take over. On the international comparisons, you see, it's above Armenia, below Tunisia. But I think that this would be a more powerful argument if there was some consistency when you make sort of comparisons of countries. You could identify different approaches having consistently different effects across the world. But of course, what we see is that some countries that do things radically differently, like Sweden and other Nordic countries, they turn out to be actually really comparable, and it not to be obviously down to different government policies that they've had different experiences. And similarly, governments which have had actually quite similar approaches. Sorry, governments that have had radically different approaches to how they tackle the coronavirus pandemic have actually seen very similar outcomes. This, to me, suggests that the power and control of government policy is vastly overestimated. In fact, just as a side point, the coronavirus has thrown up some extremely interesting points about the population of Britain that we simply didn't know before. Well, the credential of Brexit, for example, before Brexit, I think it was estimated that there were 300,000 Romanian citizens or people with Romanian citizenship living in the UK. That was according to Home Office stats, whatever. And then when the Home Office opened up visa applications, they got something like 5 times the number from 5 times the number of applications for people with from Romanian citizens than they thought were ever in the country in the first place. And there have been similar things on like hospital admissions being totally not what you would expect, given the supposed demographic breakdowns of different regions of the country. So there's an awful lot in the stats which, you know, time will eventually bear out exactly how informative they are. But it's very easy to put too much faith in sort of very reductive comparisons and very reductive sort of statistical methods. Anyway, hand it to someone else. Thank you.
And back to Luke.
So first, I'd like to address Hugo's argument that this is a virus we don't fully understand, which I think is a misleading one, because as much as we might not understand the virus on a level where we can predict exactly what's going to happen, you know, after 18 months, over 18 months of making policy on the basis of this virus, we should be able now to be able to make some sort of an effective policy. And you know, we've seen in the continued squabbling of this Conservative government that simply isn't possible. I'd also like to go back to the argument about consequentialism not being an effective means of determining a government's success. Now, as much as motive is a good indicator of moral fibre, which I don't know why Hugo would bring this up in the case of the Conservative Party, but or rather with Boris Johnson. The only real measurement of a government's success can be its effect in reality. You know, I can't name a single government that anybody would call successful that doesn't have a legacy in the institutions of this country. I would also like to talk about the idea that a government should choose people with whom it's familiar in order to make the most effective decisions on policy. I think this again is misleading. Just because a government has done business with certain individuals in the past does not mean that in a completely unprecedented situation, these people would continue to be effective in their roles. To conclude, I would say that, yes, the situation is completely unprecedented and there is much we don't understand, but this is not an excuse for this government's failures.
And back to Sam.
So I've got a few things to say. I think firstly, going back to what Johnny was saying about the government failures over winter last year, the thing he kind of forgot to mention was the fact that there was a new variant that came out, that the government and scientists didn't actually understand initially, that changed the transmissive quality, I guess, of the virus. And so when Boris Johnson promised that government that we'd have an open Christmas in October or November, the variant either didn't fully understand or hadn't emerged yet. I'm sorry, I don't quite remember the exact week by week history of it. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind, that actually there have been, this has been a moving target the entire time. Obviously, there was the Alpha variant, and then we've had the Delta variant come in, and that's had, slightly different effect on vaccines. And which brings me nicely onto vaccination. So firstly, the government vaccination policy, at least initially in the pandemic, was nothing short of outstanding. We see within 4 months of the first vaccination being administered, over nearly 50%, I believe it was 46% of the country had at least one vaccine dose. By comparison, every other Western liberal democracy had something akin to about 20%. So we'd administered something along the lines of 25 million doses. Most other countries, the US excluding, because obviously the US has a significantly large population, was about 10 million. And what has slowed down now, admittedly, I think there are a couple of things that opposition haven't kind of mentioned, structural reasons why our vaccination program has slowed down. For example, the fact that only very recently JCVI have approved vaccination for under 16s, whereas the US have been vaccinating for children over 12 the entire time. Secondly, for second doses, we've had a far longer period of, I think, incubation. Again, I don't know the medical terminology. Between first and second doses, whereas again, somewhere like the US had 3 weeks, France has somewhere like 3 weeks. Thirdly, we kind of have the problem with the Oxford vaccine. I know Johnny brings this up, how we had the biggest, I think it was Johnny brought up about we've got the biggest vaccination production in the world. Well, one of our vaccines, and the primary vaccine used at least early on in the pandemic, was the Oxford vaccine. That was what we were using, and obviously we had confidence shaken of very rare side effects, and it doesn't change the efficacy of the vaccine. I kind of want to stress that in front of room people, but likewise, there are plenty of people who had their confidence shaken by these side effects, especially young people who then had to change vaccination, which means we had to kind of change procurement strategy, we had to change distribution strategy. And that was a problem that actually we uniquely faced because we vaccinated so quickly and because we'd used a different vaccination to other countries. So I think that they don't really kind of credit that and credit the government vaccination policy. And finally, I just want to kind of conclude. Johnny again mentioned that this was concluded as the biggest public health failure in British history. I'd like to ask what else could possibly be the big public health failure in British history, insofar as there have been very few, since the creation of the health department in the 1948, I think it was 1947, there have been very few other opportunities that physically could ever be the biggest ever public health catastrophe in British history. I think that's something quite interesting to know. Of course, as I kind of said before, of course this wasn't going to be good. Of course people were going to die. The question is whether the government have done the best that they could do. Potentially, perhaps the best they could do was still always going to end somewhat in disaster because so many thousand people were going to die. So just to kind of conclude a size case, I'm not, as I said at the beginning, we're not defending everything the government have done. We're not defending every little thing that they've done. We're simply stating that in the context of the situation, in the context of the information they had, in the context of the science, in the context of other countries, and in the context of things we have actually done very well, like vaccination, like maintaining employment, for example, where the unemployment rate has only gone up, spiked at 4.8%, which was half of that during the 2008 recession. Under half that. We have done a good job in that context, or at least consider it in that context. Thank you. And I think speaking of both, we beg you to propose.
Okay.
I'll deal with Hugo first, because that seems to make sense in the order sitting. It makes sense in my mind. Hugo says we don't know a lot. We still don't know a lot. And I think this is true to some extent, but I think Hugo's argument is a little bit deceptive here. Because Hugo talks about these small things that we don't know, or matters that are of statistics that we don't know, when in reality, I agree, we don't know a lot of things about how the vaccine works. What we did know back then is certain fundamental things about how the R rate operates, how case increases operate, and how and when to lock down. And indeed, we knew this to such an extent that all other Western countries had locked down before us during the second wave. We knew there was going to be a winter surge. All the evidence suggested that COVID operated better in colder months than warmer months. We knew that a second wave was coming because other countries, and China for a small degree, Italy to a much bigger degree, had already started theirs before us. And despite that, we made no preparations over the summer. We encouraged cases to rise by having an eat out, help out system that could easily have been far less directed at human interaction. It could have been just a massive bailout package for small businesses. And just a side note on eat out, help out, I think eat out, help out was one of the most wasteful government decisions in memory, because the largest chunk of money went to Wetherspoons and McDonald's, when instead they could have been aiming this money at independents or companies at risk of going bust. I think that is a massive, massive waste of a huge opportunity to encourage British consumers to visit independents and support our high streets. And it's symptomatic of basically lazy policy making that happens in government, where they'd rather do broad brushstrokes than do the hard work to actually identify which areas of our economy need reshaping. But putting that aside, I think all these things were known about. And I think there was a massive degree of complacency, which we probably all remember, having gone out last summer. And I think it was the government's job to be on top of that, and they should have known better. PPE, Hugo says that we basically got everyone and said yes to every contract we could. First, that isn't true. We refused to take part in the largest PPE sharing program, the EU sharing program, because Boris Johnson was too proud to enter a deal with the EU Medical Agency. And I think that was disastrous. But more importantly, I think the problem of PPE was one caused by decades of underfunding, or specifically 1 decade of underfunding under successive Tory governments, that meant that we didn't have the PPE in the first place, that successive reports after Ebola and after, I think it was swine flu, had urged us to have in case of the next big pandemic. So I think those failures are much more long-lasting, but I also don't think they did nearly the due diligence that Hugo said, and yet again prioritized politics over public health. Finally, he says it's not due to government policy at all whether countries succeed or fail. And he used the thing I said about Sweden and France both having similar rates, which is true. But I think here a distinction needs to be made, because Hugo says different government approaches can have very similar results. And I agree. But government policy still has a massive responsibility for outcomes within those approaches. So Sweden and France had very different approaches, and many other countries did, but they carried out those approaches well. They organized well. They did things that Britain did, like closing off care homes at a very early rate, preventing the massive spike in deaths for old people that happened because people with COVID were going into care homes without having to check for symptoms or anything like that. I think they did lockdowns far earlier. When Sweden eventually did a lockdown in the second wave, they did it much sooner than we did. And as a result, it was A, a much shorter lockdown, and B, a far more effective lockdown, because there just were less places for cases to spread from. I think the things that matter are having good policy, not good approaches. And I think Sweden and France are evidence that no matter your approach, you can do good policy. And whether the government tried a herd immunity approach or didn't, I think it should have been possible for them to get similar policy outcomes to other countries. And they didn't, because of repeated failures to listen to SAGE. In fact, in very literal cases, they did not listen to SAGE. You will recall that Boris Johnson missed the first 7 SAGE meetings of the pandemic to work on his new book on Shakespeare. I don't think this points to very good values in government or in a prime minister. Sam claims that the failures over winter were because of Delta. I think this is true to some extent, though I think it's also true that SAGE was warning about Delta very early on in late November, and we could have locked down earlier. Boris Johnson didn't, because he didn't want to break his promise, which you can understand from a political perspective. You cannot understand it at all from a public health perspective. And I think that massively elongated the lockdown which we faced at the start of this year and was ruinous to many people's livelihoods. But I think also at the point at the start of December when we chose to leave lockdown, cases were 5 times higher than they were when we chose to leave lockdown at the summer previously. And I think what that means is we left lockdown way too prematurely because Boris Johnson made yet another stupid promise for lockdown to be 1 month only, when at the point at which we locked down, it was too late for us to have a month-long lockdown. I think those decisions combine to a ruinous public health strategy over winter. On the vaccine, I agree that there are some problems, but those are policy problems that we have created ourselves. The incubation period made sense for most of this summer. The government should and could have changed it when we needed more second doses. They haven't because they don't have a very good grasp on the organizational structure of the NHS and are postponing making serious choices. But more fundamentally, I think the vaccine story is a story of the largest producer of vaccines having fallen into our lap because of a Labour government, by the way, that helped give them the money to set up here in Cambridge. But the outcome of that is that we had a massive head start that we have squandered due to bad policy and means that we are now falling behind in the global race of vaccines and still posting very large case numbers. And still, despite having masses of AstraZeneca vaccine, which I agree are not being used, we're not rolling out booster jabs yet because there is just paralysis in government because Boris Johnson does not like making hard decisions. Sam finally says that it was always going to be the biggest public health failure. But the importance is the word failure that policy report uses. And they stress it over 100 pages explaining where and why bad decisions were made. And you can read it if you don't believe me. It wasn't just a public health disaster. And I agree, it was always going to be that. It was a failure of public health policy of a kind unprecedented and of a very different, in a very different way to anything that's gone before, because the government has repeatedly intervened to overrule scientists' desires to have a proper public health response in the name of politics. That is why it's been a failure. And I think you should judge the government on their record. 2,000 cases, 2,000 deaths per million is a lot of premature deaths that could have been avoided. It is a very, very high degree that places us in the ranks of third world countries like Armenia, Tunisia, and America. And I think you have to judge them on that record, because as Hugo says, we can't know what Boris Johnson was thinking. I think it's pretty clear that he doesn't have a cohesive public health philosophy or any real philosophy. And I think when evaluating this response, we have all the facts, as much as Hugo quibbles, already to say that this is a failure that places us right at the bottom of Western countries. And I think that it's one that's very difficult not to place at Boris Johnson's door. So in summing up, I just say, judge them on their record and judge them quite harshly.
Before we take 1 or 2 student questions, I'd just like to get another indication of where we stand. So can we raise hands if we are at this moment siding with John T, Luke and Jonathan? Right, okay. And for the camera that cannot see the audience, that was, I'd say, maybe 90, 95%. 100% apparently, okay. And anyone in support of Hugo and Sam? For the cameras, that is no one at this moment. So is anyone wanting to raise any questions to anyone in particular? Yeah.
Right, full disclosure, I left halfway through for a bit, so if I'm repeating myself, Fergal, can you just give me a tap on the shoulder? Cheers, if I'm repeating anything they said. Holy smokes, I never thought I would find the day where a Conservative member suggested that we judge a government based on its intentions and idealism rather than the effects of its policy. And I'm kind of kicking myself here because I am feverish with excitement that somebody's brought up consequentialism, deontology in a politics debate. It's literally made my day. But I'm really sort of just saying and asking what Luke, I do believe, said significantly more succinctly than me. But this is the stick that the Conservative Party has beaten left-wing groups for forever, and not entirely, not entirely wrongly. Obviously, the left, correctly or incorrectly, likes to think of itself as sort of a group that has, some level of sort of, it's got a level of, some people will call it moral superiority, some people call it smugness about itself, but it's certainly sort of, a group that enjoys thinking of itself as sort of coming from good intentions, to which point, I think you would agree that largely on the right wing, a lot of people, and especially the Conservative Party, I'm looking to people like Thatcher here, frequently go, well, yeah, great intentions, socialism's good on paper, wouldn't it be nice if it worked in practice? And then imagine my surprise to hear today you saying, well, but we shouldn't be judging the government on the consequences of its actions. We ought to be judging the government on, well, how it felt when it went in there, whether they were gunning for the right stuff. I fundamentally can't read Boris Johnson's mind, and I cannot reasonably make a claim that he is an evil individual or a callous individual or a cruel individual. Those would be unfair charges, perhaps, perhaps not. There were some very valid points made on this side. But do you not agree on some level that the second where we go, oh, well, we should not be judging the government on the effectiveness of its policy, we should be judging it on whether it hoped it would turn out all right, which, to be fair, as a position can be justified selfishly or selflessly. No government wants to suck, do they, right? No government wants to create a public health crisis. Can you not agree on some level that could be taken as arguing in bad faith? Can you not agree on some level that could be considered arguing in bad faith? Just in, is that the right term? Maybe I've mistaken my terms there. What I meant is sort of maybe, it's not the most watertight argument in the world. Your consequentialist one. Thanks. I'm getting quite anxious now.
I'm so glad someone asked this.
Oh no, I thought that.
No, well, first it'll help me clear something up. I did working with a slight false dichotomy between either judging it on the effects of its policies or based on its ideology. And I think the criticism that the people on the right always make on the left is that they're being dogmatic, that they've taken like principles that are supposedly, I don't know, transcendentally dictated by, I don't know, Karl Marx or someone, I don't know, but they get them from somewhere and then they apply them rigorously with sort of blinders on. And I mean, there are, you could have a different ideology that comes from somewhere else. I think the point I was making was about judging them on their reasoning, and you could have a non-dogmatic. You can reason practically in a non-dogmatic way. So you could take and conservatives, long tradition, a very proud tradition of taking into effect like economic science, so-called. So I wasn't claiming that there's firstly that I've suddenly discovered a sort of deep and fundamental conservative philosophy which has been guiding principles all the way through. Nor was I trying to diminish the criticism that we always make of you lot, that you do have this deep philosophy, and that philosophy is wrong. Rather, it was just about judging them on the reasons that they cited in the first place. Your point about not knowing Boris Johnson's mind. I mean, thank goodness. Imagine what it would be like to know what goes inside that head. But this, to me, opens up a difference in approach that, for me, characterizes one of the big differences between the right and the left. Is you can kind of choose what interpretive stance to take towards someone. Like you can choose whether you're going to assume the worst of them, or you can choose whether you're going to assume the best of them. And conservatives in general, I think, are very optimistic about their fellow human beings and human beings throughout history. There's a sort of tendency on the left to sort of reach for the tinfoil, to assume that everyone's out to get you. So part of what I was trying to say is that there is a way of reading the government's response to the pandemic as I think a principled approach. If you could do that, why wouldn't you? You could live in a world where the government is sort of honest and moral. You could live in a world where it's like deeply cynical and self-serving. And between the two, like there's not really any good reasons for choosing one over the other in terms of like the facts. So why not just choose the more optimistic one?
Because they're both the same. It's more of a response back. Because it's the same.
Well, I mean that's I mean that's there's a couple of things going on there. One, I mean, it's perfectly plausible. I'm sorry, everyone, we're in the realms of political philosophy. It's perfectly within the bounds of a really sort of righteous government to sort of accidentally cause the death of. I mean, you could be really well intentioned but completely incompetent. I'm not saying that's what the government is. I'm also, and I think you've committed the fallacy that Luke very rightly and consciously avoided at the very beginning of saying the government is responsible for 140,000 deaths. I mean, I think you have to do quite a lot of work before you can draw a sort of really strong causal link between decisions made in the cabinet office, or what's it called? Yes, in the cabinet office briefing room, and like deaths on the scale of tens of thousands.
Morally dubious after discussion, just witness.
Yeah, well, I know. Yeah, and just on the point of like government morally dubious, it's interesting that there's this very common like assumption that Tory government it must be awful people. Now, I have the misfortune of having met like quite a lot of Conservative MPs and MP foreign ministers, and I know this isn't going to convince any of you, but they've always seemed to me to be sort of really people of like deep integrity who really want to do the best for their constituents, and you can always rely on certain parts of the press and people with different to find the sort of worst possible interpretation for.
Can I add, like, politics, I think we could have the last 10 years, 11 years of Conservative government, like, certainly amongst our age group, I think, okay, the Tories are ignoring that, and their politician are great. I think pretty much every government has got this kind of questionable moral political power at some point in time. So I'm not really sure if it's necessarily a relevant thing to kind of say, oh, we're going to criticize playing politics and being politicians when they're politicians. And ultimately, there are yes, it's public health crisis. Yes, we should be focusing on public health crisis in the same way they have their duties to well the current system. And you can't, such as the nature of the system, moral people function.
Sorry, just before we go on, I've got to go, but I want to know that's for other reasons I didn't get that dropped. Like, as in, I'm going, but like, I'm not hanging my head.
Can I take the mic on, please? Yeah, we are running quite a bit over. What I can say though is that if you would like to maybe get involved with the Labour Society or the Conservative Society, perhaps you could carry this on. But we are, oh, is the time for one more? Okay. One more question, yeah? I can't decide. Let's go with you. I think you were first at the very back.
So, I regret to announce that after about 10 minutes of discussing consequentialism, I'm here to revive the debate. So you do caution against the consequentialist evaluation of the coronavirus response, as you say effects can be misleading. So let us briefly examine principle in its place. Our constitution was eviscerated by the ghastly Coronavirus Act. We effectively descended into a police state, government by decree, in the words of that infamous Marxist Lord Jonathan Sumption. And some punishments for breaching COVID restrictions exceeded those for sexual assault and possession of a firearm with criminal intent. Now, the government may not be responsible for 140,000 deaths, as you rightly say, but surely it is solely responsible for constitutional vandalism and procedural incompetence, regardless of whether you take a consequentialist or moralist approach. Thank you.
The constant, well, microphone. I mean, it's there's a place for you on the slightly nutty right wing of the Conservative Party on thinking that like lockdown and isolation is sort of the height of all tyranny. As I said at the beginning, I mean, the coronavirus, it totally changed the way we think about like what we owe to each other in society and what we owe to society in general. Because suddenly, like I can't. It was suddenly impossible to think of like individual action being something that was like broadly inconsequential for people at large. So there's no longer the mantra of, oh, well, everyone can make their own decision about it, because ultimately they can be aware of the risks and they can go about doing it. Actually, because of the way that a pandemic works, suddenly like me going about doing something which is often no risk to me, does suddenly put lots of other people at risk. And suddenly me going about doing one thing and no one else going about doing it, that's fine. But me going about doing something and lots of other people enjoying that same freedom is terrible. And so it throws up all these problems about freedom that the Constitution needs to be flexible enough to deal with. I mean, luckily it was flexible enough to deal with. I'm as glad as you surely are that there are sunset clauses on all these things so that they won't hang around forever. It seems a little odd to sort of criticize the government for being, on the one hand, far too relaxed, and, opening up too early and eat out to help out, at the same time being far too strict and taking away too many of our freedoms. Yeah, I think we should maybe chat a bit afterwards, because this will be a bit long-winded. But there probably isn't like an ism that I can, I don't know, liberalism or fascism, and say like that was the government's guiding principle. I mean, I think the modern Conservative Party is like broadly pluralist about value, and most people will in the Conservative will agree that like there are lots of different considerations that need to come into account. Like we don't like being dogmatic and saying this is how we do things. And so there were all sorts of accommodations and compromises to be made. And I think largely they got those compromises and accommodations right. But yeah, let's speak that.
Can we give a round of applause for our speakers, please? Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. We have plenty on at KP this week. I think you mentioned Lord Sumption at the beginning. Yeah, he's coming to KP. Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone.